Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our discussion around Laudate Deum, the Pope's recent exhortation on the environment. My name's Eileen, I work for CAFOD's volunteer support team, and I'm pleased to be joined today by a wonderful panel of guests who are going to lead us through some thoughts on the exhortation. Welcome. I've got with me tonight Father George Sigamoney. Father George is a CAFOD Trustee, a former director of Caritas Sri Lanka, and has worked with Caritas in Australia and across Asia. He's currently pursuing his doctorate in Sydney. Father George is also a lifelong cricket fan, so we need to keep him in our thoughts at the moment, as Sri Lanka are not doing terribly well in the World Cup. Better luck next time, Father George. We also have with us Joanna Nwosu. Joanna is CAFOD's Head of Programme Quality and Partner Support, and previously worked for CAFOD's long-term partner, Caritas Nigeria. As a lifelong nature lover, Joanna remembers dreaming of being a vet as she was growing up and bringing home stray or injured animals, lizards, frogs, birds, abandoned kittens, and on one occasion, a tortoise. So we're pleased to have such an environmental expert with us tonight, Joanna.
Thank you.
And we also have Gareth Rowe. Gareth is the CAFOD-Durham Research Fellow, CAFOD's first ever research fellow, straddling the worlds of academia and theology in practice. Gareth is a lay Carmelite and was recently ordained to the permanent diaconate. Gareth lists Pope Leo XIII, who began the canon of Catholic social teaching, as one of his heroes because of the inspirational way that he started something off that would bear fruit in the future, rather than just trying to dominate the present. I think that's a very wise person to have as a hero, and we'll be seeing tonight whether we think that the Pope's latest exhortation will be having great effects into the future. Now, if you're joining us tonight, you might be able to see a little box in the corner of your screen. It might be like a speech bubble shape, and it says Q&A. If you have any questions as we go, type your questions in there. It's really great if you can do them as we're going along, because that means we can feed them into our conversation. If you see someone else's question that you really like, there is an upvote button, and I think it looks a bit like a thumbs up. If you upvote the questions, that will help us see which ones are most popular and which to put to our panel. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing us during the session, you can put a message in there as well, and we'll try and help you as much as possible. There'll be a recording sent to you after the session, and please feel free to share that with your friends and family. So before we start our discussion, we have a very short video from the Vatican, just introducing the exhortation. So that video is very exciting and has great music. I really love it. So I'm going to turn to Gareth first to tell us a bit more about this exciting exhortation. Do you think maybe you could give us just some brief background for people who aren't too familiar about maybe Laudato Si first, and why you think Pope Francis decided to give us Laudate Deum now?
Yeah, thank you. Just a bit of background, really. Both Laudato Si and Laudate Deum fit in with Catholic social teaching. Now, Catholic social teaching has been around since 1891, And what happens is each of the popes have written encyclicals, which is just another word for letters to all of the churches, which address the issues that happened at the time. So I would say there's three stages, really. The first stage is really in response to the Industrial Revolution, and it's about the plight of workers in the factories. And all of the early encyclicals, really since 1891 to the Second World War, are really all about that, about workers, capital, and about private property. And then it expands into more of an international phase. And from 1967 onwards, the first encyclical on international development. And that carries us right through to 2009, where we have this international phase in Catholic social teaching. And then after that, we have Pope Francis, and Pope Francis moves it on to another level, really. He starts to bring in other things. And one of the things he starts to bring in is the environment. And it's not just about humanity anymore. It's about humanity, but in our place in the world, amongst the other creatures, amongst the rest of God's creation. So you can see a kind of movement there, an expansive movement from something which is quite narrow and focused on the Industrial Revolution to something which becomes really, really broad and brings in more and more things. That takes us really to Laudato Si, which was all about the environment. It was an encyclical letter on the environment, so it was a big, expansive letter which really treated in detail all about the problems with the environment, but from a religious perspective, from a Catholic perspective. That was a few years ago now. And Laudate Deum comes in response to that. I would say that it's come out at this time because very little has happened in response to Laudato Si. There hasn't been enough action. Laudato Si was a big, expansive piece. Laudate Deum is a much shorter piece. It's not an encyclical letter, it's an exhortation. And the word exhortation, when you use it for a papal document, means let's take some action. So this is about really encouraging people to take action on the back of what's happened with the climate.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And I think we saw a lot of action in that video, didn't we? And I know when I read the encyclical, I really felt that call to action as well. If anyone hasn't read it yet, sorry, exhortation, not encyclical, it is available in the handout section of this webinar, so you can have a look and download it and read it afterwards if you'd like to. Gareth, I know that Laudato Si had massive impact on CAFOD's work, and when we heard this new exhortation was coming out, a lot of us were quite excited, and we were referring to it as Laudato Si 2 is coming out. What do you think of that title? What do you feel it adds? Is it a sequel?
So I would say it's not a sequel. It's been described as an addendum. It's an extra part. It's much shorter than Laudato Si, and it does something very different. What it does, it exhorts, it asks us to take action. It says on the back of Laudato Si, there was not enough action taking place. What can we do about this now? Because we need to do something really, really quickly. The other thing to say is it's different. As well as being an exhortation, it's very clearly addressed to all people of goodwill. Now, it's not the first papal document that's addressed to all people of goodwill, but it's very specific that it's just addressed to all people of goodwill. So it's not just for the Catholic faithful, it's for all people, and it's for all people to take action. So it's not really Laudato Si Part 2, it's an extension of that. And I think that comes through in the topics as well. It's not really about saying something new and saying something different. It's about adding to what the Pope's already said before. It's about adding to what Laudato Si has already said before. So some of the specific additions that I would like to draw your attention to. First is the real engagement with science and politics, much more than we've seen, not only that more than we've seen from Pope Francis, but more than we've seen from any pope really. It's very specific. It starts with the science, and it goes all the way through the science before it gets to anything else. That makes some really specific comments about politics as well. It's very engaged with a particular issue. The other thing I would say, it extends what Pope Francis has talked about before. He talks about the technocratic paradigm. He says that he talks about the technocratic paradigm in many of his documents. By the technocratic paradigm, he means technology, but he means technology which no longer serves us, but technology which has come to dominate in some way. And there's something, I mean, Pope Francis never uses the word demonic in there, but there's something kind of demonic about this technocratic paradigm. He talks in the exhortation about a human being with no limits. He talks about creation being our slave. He talks about the chilling power of the few at the expense of the many and at the expense of creation. I mean, pretty strong stuff, pretty strong language that's being used in here, which reflects the Pope's view of where we're at and where the planet is at. Just another couple of things to add there. He talks about our children. He talks about our children a lot and how our children are going to pay for our inaction over the climate. And then he talks about multilateralism. And he kind of says two different things about multilateralism. One is he reaffirms the importance of agreements between states, of those big kind of agreements between nations that can only happen at a high level. But he also talks about how we've got a much more multipolar world. It's not like it was in the Cold War where two big powers can decide everything. There's lots more sources of agency at the moment, smaller countries, but also big corporations and so on who have more power than many smaller countries. But also our agency, your agency, and my agency, and what can we do to help in this current situation? He even says every little helps, and every little really can help. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to draw attention to is this idea of the spiritual motivations. Unlike many documents, he ends with the spiritual motivations. He doesn't start with that. And again, I think there he moves papal teaching on. He talks about a situated anthropocentrism. So yes, people are really, really important still, and the Pope would be the first person to say it's the poor that are paying the price for the climate and direct us to that. But it's not just about humans, it's about the other creatures, it's about the world as a whole, which I think is a development of Catholic social teaching. And just to do a short pitch for the project I'm doing with CAFOD at the moment, but the project I'm doing at the moment is about the spirituality of encountering the catastrophic reality that we're seeing around us at the moment. What sort of spiritual resources do we have to help us face the current situation? Well, one of the spiritual resources we have is the teaching of Pope Francis, and particularly his teaching on the environment in these two documents.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That's a really interesting overview. If I could move over to you now, Father George, is the Pope's message in Laudate Deum and in Laudato Si, is that something that rings true to you, given your work around the world in emergency situations and working with communities?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because the very word is praise God. So like each and every one of us got a great responsibility to praise God for his creation. But like Pope Francis, in a beautiful way, is speaking about the effects in the areas of healthcare, sources of employment, access to resources, housing, and forced migration, where those areas are really like direct effects of this climate, the crisis what we are just like having. And it's all, as he says, like it's directly it's affecting the poorest of the poor and also the most vulnerable. So I remember working in the especially in these situations when in the year the tsunami hit on the Boxing Day, And it's like it directly just like was a kind of a shocking thing for everyone. Like it's like it never just chose it only for the poor or so vulnerable. Like it's like everyone was affected by tsunami. And it's same with like especially like in some of the disasters, natural disasters we had it in Asia region, like the Nepal earthquake and also the typhoon in the Philippines. I can just like list out like what we really went through like continuously or going through at the particular time. But like what happens, like why Pope Francis is like talking like it's directly affecting the poorest of the poor. Yeah, it's like the as I said, like some people were able to really come out of the situation, and it's like because they had the influence, they had the power, but the most vulnerable and the poor couldn't come out of what really they faced at that particular time or like facing in this particular situation. And I will say like still like even after so many years with the what happened in the tsunami, still some of the people living with the same poor condition of the effects of that tsunami. And like it's affected like their livelihood. And so many people lost their livelihood and still couldn't come out of that particular situation. And it's same with like every disaster when it's like a natural disaster takes place. And it's directly affecting the poorest of the poor because they will never be able to come out of the situation of what really like affects them from there. And it's also like as Pope Francis is saying that it's in a way it's like just like makes them to like move from of their natural life to a kind of totally different life. They have to like depend, they go for dependency. And where like he's speaking about forced migration here. And I remember like especially like most of the families couldn't really like didn't have any way of living. So what happened there, they started to like find different ways for them to like somehow or other to help their families. So some of the women at that particular time started to move to different countries to work as domestic workers. And where that Pope Francis is saying like the forced migration, like in such a way. And there are some, like for an example, I can give some statistics there. Like I was like working with the migrants at that time in the commission. And for a month, it's so unfortunate, like we were like getting back nearly about 28 dead bodies of the migrant workers. And these were the poorest of the poor. And they went because they didn't have any way of living. Some of, especially like they were women, and they went to some of these countries and they were treated very badly in those countries. And for a year, that at that time, like we were nearly like just getting the reports about like 800 to 1,000 men and women were returned in their own countries, either disabled, and they were like, especially the women and the like girls, those who were going, they were like sexually they were abused. So it's so like pathetic to see like when Pope Francis speaks about like the crisis here, the climate crisis, it's in a way is affecting in so many ways the poorest of the poor. Is something like we can't even imagine. Like we will talk like so many things like in different forms. Like I just wanted to say like how the climate changes also like has just like affecting some of the crises, especially the effects in the jungle areas back in Sri Lanka, because that we are going through a huge problem of elephant and human conflict. And it's because of deforestation. And with the deforestation, like it's now, like if you just go back to Sri Lanka and find like Google, the elephant and human conflicts, like at least it kills like at least for a week, at least 3 to 4 human beings. And in the same way, the elephants are being killed. So it's like just going in a totally different way than that what we can imagine. So I think like very timely, Pope Francis is bringing all these stories and just talking, say like it's a great responsibility of us to like at least to open our eyes now to just look at what's happening in the world, especially how it's affecting the poorest of the poor.
Thank you, Father George. And that's so helpful to hear the effects that you've observed, because it just showed the enormity of the impacts of climate change. But of course, you're not just a humanitarian, you're a priest as well. And I was interested, the people that you serve as a priest, your congregation, do they talk to you about climate change? Do they talk to you about facing that catastrophic reality that Gareth mentioned?
It's like, you know, like you just like experience in your own day-to-day life what's this really like, it's like is happening, is affecting people as well as like your own life as well. Because like it's like it's something like you go through in your day-to-day life. And when I just like I was able to like to travel to most of these areas like where we experience these natural disasters. And when you really speak about to some of these people who were directly affected, and it's so sad to see like some of the children couldn't like continue their studies because they were doing well, and with the natural disaster, it's like the whole life was totally like in a way disturbed, and they couldn't like move from there forward. So like people like talking to every one of you, like in their day-to-day life experience and so on. That's something very sad to like see and go through.
Excuse me. How does it affect your ministry with those communities when they're going through such difficult times?
Oh, I will say like it will become always a kind of a challenge. It's not going to affect you, but like it's like it will give you some way for you to do more to these people. So it's like it will call you to do something to change the situation. But like it's not easy, because like you are just like sometimes you become only one individual. But like it has to be a kind of a collective kind of effect. So like when you speak about kind of a collective effort, that it has to like come from the local as well as from kind of a middle level as well as from the upper level. So it has to like reach out to every level, and everyone has to like work together. So that's something I think like we need to really focus on.
It's that kind of multilateralism that Pope Francis is talking about. Yeah. Maybe we can bring Joanna in at this point, because we've been talking about the poorer communities and how they're affected, and Pope Francis talks about amplifying those voices of poor communities. Can you tell us a little bit about what CAFOD can do about that with an international agency?
Yes. Well, I think as CAFOD, we're in a unique position to respond to this call, because we work with partners that serve some of the most marginalized communities in the world. And we do this in multiple countries across the globe. And so this work brings us very close to the people who are actually bearing the greatest burden of the climate crisis. Be that when we respond to humanitarian emergencies, for instance, like flooding or wildfires, but also in some of the work that we do on the more chronic impacts of climate change. So things like failed harvests in areas where we're having more incidents of drought. And then the more distal consequences of climate change, like some of what Father George alluded to, like displacement or migration, as people move in search of farmland. For example, in Africa, they're looking for farmland, or they're looking for pasture for their animals. And in Africa, quite a few of the intercommunal conflicts we see are linked to this kind of migration. And it's not always immediately obvious that there is a connection to climate change. So we, and when I say we, I mean our partners, really, because our partners are like our eyes and ears and hands and feet. You know, we come up against these impacts daily. And the reality of these vulnerable people, the poorest of the poor, is very far removed from the lives of people who sit in the conference rooms and make these decisions about, you know, power plants and fossil fuel use and no disrespect to the people who make these decisions, but it's a lot easier to close your eyes to a problem when it seems like it's really far away from you. So we work with these vulnerable people to try to help them with humanitarian support, livelihood support, support for housing. But what we are able to do in addition is to capture their stories. So we capture their stories in print, sometimes, through reports and research studies, photos, in video, in voice. We can share these stories online. We can share them in person. And then we can put them like front and center in those spaces where these decisions are made. And some of our supporters who are watching would have joined campaigns, for instance, organized by CAFOD, in which we try to remind decision makers about their responsibilities towards the global family of humanity and, our common home, the earth and the environment. And from time to time, CAFOD is able to actually bring people from these regions that are most affected into the decision-making spaces so that they can tell these stories themselves. So in Laudato Deum, the Holy Father, he makes explicit reference to COP28, for instance. And for a number of years, CAFOD has been facilitating participation at the COP. The COPs are the annual conferences at which these climate change issues are discussed. In COP28, for example, which is coming up in Dubai, in a few weeks, actually, we're going to be supporting participation of a few countries. So we're going to be supporting representation from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, from Brazil, from Central America to the COP. And the most obvious part of this support is financial, as you can imagine. There's a lot of logistic cost involved, things like visa fees and travel expenses and hotel accommodation for people to come to the COP. But it's more than that. And the work of supporting this sort of amplifying voices, it starts months and years before any of these international conferences. So it starts at local level in these countries, helping communities and partners to gather the evidence of how climate change is impacting them and helping them to gain traction and political respect in their own spaces by coming together to form alliances, by talking to their own government representatives. We help them to prepare advocacy kits and talking points so that when they do come into these spaces, they're better prepared to be able to present their case and explain why there is so much urgency around some of these climate change issues that they're facing. Just last week, for instance, we launched a report on a piece of research that was supported by CAFOD, and it was carried out by CAFOD partners in India and Bangladesh. And the focus is on how climate change is contributing to human trafficking in the Sundarbans mangrove forest area. So this is an area at the border between India and Bangladesh, which is a very low-lying area, and it's one of the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change, particularly to sea level rise. And this piece of research showed that, the impact of climate change is pushing people out of, Father George mentioned this, is denying them the land for their livelihood. And as a result, they become very vulnerable to being trafficked to other countries. And then some of this research is going to be messaged at COP28 by the representatives, from Bangladesh themselves. So this is the kind of work that we do that helps to bring attention to the situation of these vulnerable and often overlooked voices.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And Pope Francis also talks about something like multilateralism from the bottom up, which I think is slightly different from this work and to do with building connections at many levels, as well as holding decision makers more firmly to account. What do you think he means by those? And does CAFOD have a role to play there as well?
Yes, I think Gareth touched on this a little bit when he was speaking. I think what the Holy Father is trying to say is that traditional multilateralism is not enough. And so what is multilateralism? It's a way that people come together. It's a way of working together in response to the realization that this problem we're trying to solve is bigger than what any one person can do through their individual efforts. And nations have been coming together to do top-down multilateralism for years. I mean, the Holy Father, he devotes a whole section or chapter in Laudato Deum, like recounting the history of these various international meetings and treaties and agreements, like starting back in 1992 at the Rio Conference, which we call COP1. And now we're in COP28. So, way back from the early 90s, the international community has been coming together almost every year to discuss this issue around the climate. And yet, global emissions continue to increase. So why? I mean, seems to be happening is that these multilateral discussion spaces, they're often dominated by a few entities that have a lot of power. And they're also influenced in the background by a lot of capitalist interests that are backing the various governments that come to those treaties. Come to those conferences and sign those treaties. And the other dynamic that happens is, people come to the conferences, leaders make promises, but then they go back home and then they cave into pressure from power blocks and lobbyists and commercial interests, and then they start to make an about turn on some of their commitments. So what the Holy Father is proposing, as I understand it, is that we bring in an additional dimension now to multilateralism. So we have the nations coming together at the high level. We also need people and communities to come together from below. And just as you said, Eileen, to unite and hold our elected representatives, accountable. So he's asking us to be bold. He's asking us to form alliances. He's asking us to build a movement. So it's a movement of citizens. It's a movement of activists. It's a movement of charities like CAFOD and many others who are like-minded in wanting to put human rights and human dignity and the situation of the most vulnerable and poorest of the poor at the center of decision-making. And then if we can all come together and speak out with one voice in support of this action, to reduce emissions, to phase out fossil fuels, it becomes a lot harder for the people that are making the decisions at the high level to do an about turn after they have signed these agreements. And, it connects into some of, the efforts that I mentioned earlier to also amplify the voices of the most vulnerable, because when we have those sorts of alliances, we have it here in the UK, we have it in Australia, and then we have people in Bangladesh, we have people in, Mozambique, Bolivia, Brazil, and, it's almost like the global voice is saying the same thing. And then we bring that pressure. So that seems to be what Pope Francis is encouraging us to do. And, I feel like, we just have a responsibility to be more courageous, to speak out, to demand accountability. And we're already doing this, but this new exhortation, like Gareth said, is like, take action. It brings an increased sense of urgency and impetus to our efforts in this area.
Great, thank you. We will be having another webinar on the 23rd of November, specifically about COP28, where I think we've got some of our partners coming to speak about their involvement as well. So everyone at home, do check that out if you're interested in finding out a bit more about COP. But a question we've had in, which I guess links in a bit to that movement building you've been talking about, Joanna. People are talking about, John and Anita have both asked about how do we get the message out in our parishes. John specifically says Laudato Si is not well known enough. So how do we get Laudate Deum into our parishes? Father George, you're a parish priest. Do you have ideas about how we can spread the word within our parishes?
Yeah, one thing that I just feel at this particular moment is very important to see what's happening around the world. So continuously, we are going through a lot of natural disasters. Everywhere you hear earthquakes, floods, and so many things are happening around the world. So I am sure everyone is quite aware it's because of what's happening in the world is our own fault. So I think it's important to take this message to the parishes, and through the parishes, it's important to take more preventions in different ways to take the message of how that we need to really care for the earth. because it's important, like everyone's responsibility also to care for our Mother Earth. And I think like it's not only the Christian responsibility, but like as humans, everyone has to like respond very positively towards this. So I think it's a global responsibility now for every one of us to like respond very positively at this moment.
There's a number of ways, really practical ways, that people can get involved as well if they want to. I mean, at a basic level, send the link to this webinar round to people in the parish. That's something you could do. Why not organise a discussion group? Laudate Deum is a very short document. It would be something you could read paragraphs of and talk about the paragraphs of. Or if you want to do something a little bit more, CAFOD's got the Live Simply Award. Have a look on the CAFOD website at the Live Simply Award and see what you could actually do in your parish to claim the things you're already doing and to move people on in terms of how they can live simply and live in solidarity with people around the world.
And I also feel like it's the responsibility of the parish priest to like work very closely with CAFOD at this particular time, because like the Caritas, so CAFOD is the social arm of the Catholic Church. So like we as the church has got a greater responsibility to work towards the social reformation. So this is the time for us to do. So the parish priests also have to like come closer to work with CAFOD at this point. So I think like I'm sure like the volunteers are like very much involved with the parish priest. I think another way for them to just work at this moment.
Thank you both. Lots of ideas for us to run with there. And we must get talking to our parishes and to our parish priests about this. I think we have to remember we don't need to know all the answers, but if we can start a discussion, that's really positive. I've got another question here that's been upvoted a lot from another Francis, not Pope Francis. It says, thanks to everyone. Can I ask Gareth, Pope Francis is a Jesuit and majors on Franciscan spirituality in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. But are there other spiritual traditions which can help us to face the catastrophic realities and also see what new worlds could be emerging from our difficulty?
Absolutely. I mean, Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and for those of you who know about Jesuit spirituality, one of the things the Jesuits do really well is discernment. So they look at the world around them and really think about how they can discern what's happening in the world and how you can move on. But Pope Francis, he took the name Francis, didn't he, from Francis of Assisi, and is really pointing us towards Franciscan spirituality there, brother sun, sister moon, all of those sorts of things. The spirituality I'm most involved with is the Carmelite spirituality, and I think the Carmelite spirituality adds a completely different lens on this. I've been doing quite a lot of work recently on St. John of the Cross and his idea of the dark night. There's a modern Carmelite writer called Constance Fitzgerald who talks about our situation as being dark night, but the word she uses is impasse. So an impasse is when you can't think what to do next. And this really resonates with me because I think as a society, as a planet, as the people, we can't think what to do next. We want to do the right thing. So many of us want to do the right thing, but we don't know how to do that. And the Carmelite lens on that is this idea of impasse. And the Carmelite tradition is a contemplative tradition, so it's really focused on prayer. And one of the things that Constance Fitzgerald, an American Carmelite, says is that we have to take this in prayer. It's not just about activism, and I'm not denigrating activism at all. We need to take action, but that action needs to be accompanied by prayer. We need to be holding this really very difficult situation that the world's in at the moment before God in prayer. We need to admit that we don't have all of the answers, and we need to ask for help. And I think the Carmelite spirituality and that idea of impasse, of dark night, of not knowing where to go next, it is a really powerful lens through which to view this current situation.
Thank you, Gareth. That's very insightful and something I'm sure we can all take away with us as well. We've had G. Mulcrow, who's written in, it would be interesting to see examples of how climate change contributes to other issues in addition to human trafficking. Joanna, I'm not sure if there's something you could add there from your long work with partners.
Yes, so we mentioned human trafficking earlier. I also touched very briefly on migration, which is slightly different in context from human trafficking. This is more, we see this quite a lot in Africa, where like whole communities of people who have traditionally existed on an agricultural-based livelihood, as for instance the Sahel, what we call the Sahel, so the desert area in the center of the continent is beginning to expand, and people are no longer able to cultivate, and so harvests fail. We have at the moment a huge response in a part of East Africa called the East Africa Food Crisis Response. So in this area, harvests have failed repeatedly for, I think this is the 6th year running that the harvest has failed, and as a result, people have no food to eat. The crisis response we're doing at the moment is actually a humanitarian response where we're giving food rations to the most vulnerable households, mainly households that have very young children or pregnant women because they can't afford to eat. And linked to that then is a lot of people then moving to areas where the land is still more fertile. And then, when they come there, it's almost they don't always receive a warm welcome because there's competition for land and resources. So as a result, you see, conflicts breaking out and, there's fighting in different places. So, these are some of the impacts. It affects people's livelihoods, especially. It affects their nutrition, and it forces them out of their homes and forces them to move from one place to the other. So these are just some of the immediate impacts. We also have, I touched briefly on the flooding. We have an increase in flooding. Last year, Pakistan was, completely flooded. I think 10% of the entire landmass of the country was underwater because, we started having more torrential rains and storms, and also with the impact of sea level rise. You might have seen some of the pictures of some of the island nations in particular parts of the world where there is a threat that in the next 50 to 100 years, some of those island nations will completely cease to exist because the rising level of the sea as a result of the melting of the polar ice caps, the sea is just going to cover some of those islands. And then those people, they become homeless and stateless, and they have to figure out, like, where do we live? Where do we move to? So there's so much that climate change is doing in terms of, and it's always the poorest people who feel it the most, because the people who have the resources, they can get up and they can move to somewhere else. And in many cases, they also have the skills that are marketable in other parts of the world. So they could, migrate to somewhere else. But the poorest of the poor, they have nowhere to go and nowhere to help, no one to help them.
Pope Francis keeps saying everything is connected and nobody is saved alone. He repeats that over and over again. I've just finished a different project with CAFOD where we spoke to people throughout the world, throughout the global south and in the UK as well about the problems that they were facing. And there is a real sense that when people's vulnerabilities increase, when people, as Joanna was describing, are forced to move out of stable local communities, they become more and more vulnerable, and it's almost as if negative forces start to swirl around these people. We use the phrase in Laudate Deum. Pope Francis talks about structures of sin. And structures, he talks about the climate crisis being an example of a structure of sin. Structural sin is a concept that's been in Catholic social teaching for a long time. In the project we've been doing, we talk about vortices of sin, that real sense of almost like a whirlpool swirling around vulnerable people as they move out of their communities. people trafficking, migration, war, civil unrest. All of these things are interconnected with one another and are just massively exacerbated by the climate crisis. They were exacerbated by the pandemic as well.
Brother George, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, just like I very much agree with Joanna as well, because like when it comes to Asia and Africa, and these are like more agricultural countries and like very much depending on seasonal agriculture. So when it comes to seasonal agriculture, like it's the climate, it's like due time that we need the rain for the paddy cultivations, for other cultivations. And like when it comes to harvesting time, that we don't need the rain. So it has to be kind of a moderate like weather. So the weather has totally changed now. So the people, like especially the farmers, like they have no way of just doing any way of any kind of a cultivation. So naturally that like they don't have any food at the moment, and it's directly affecting like the way it's like at present, especially the healthcare. Like you can't imagine like different like the problems, the health problems in some of these countries, like what they are faced with, like in even the pandemic situation, like it's everywhere. It's like as Joanna said, the powerful people had a way of just like going to different, like move to different countries, and since that they are like professionals in those like powerful countries, they were very much welcomed. But it's not the same with the poorest of the poor. So that still that they go through a lot of hardships and so on. And especially it's like affecting the most vulnerable, especially the women and children. Why? Because they work in such situations. They don't have much of a voice, and they totally lost the voice in this particular situation because they are very vulnerable. I just like wanted to just take one of the examples here, because like one of these the migrant worker who went to work in a particular country, and as soon as that they landed in that particular country, her passport was taken away from her. And she was working in this particular house for almost 14 years, and like hardly like proper treatment that she got it there. Like there's no proper food and no proper sleeping time and so on. And at one point, like she made a mistake of like just breaking one of the glasses or something, probably like valuable thing. But the punishment she was like, she had it at that time. Like she was inserted with like nails into her body. So like she got like 48 nails, and like it's like affected her health, and she was just like brought back to Sri Lanka, and unfortunately she died. And another girl, like because of the poverty in the family, because that was a kind of a real agricultural like farming area, and because that like they couldn't do any farming agriculture, so this young girl has to like find a way to like support the family. She was only 14 years at that time, so the agents, they totally changed her passport and made it like saying like she was 21 and sent to this particular country. And while like she was working and she had to like take care of her infant, and she was like feeding milk to that girl, like, and the milk got choked and the child died. And the punishment she was got like beheaded, like she was beheaded and she died. And like you can just like go on with stories how this is affecting so many people, especially the poor and the vulnerable people. So I think like it's the effect, as Pope Francis is saying, that these are the effects that we are experiencing because of the climate change.
Thank you, everyone. Some really distressing stories there. I have a question from Diane here as well, who says, dark night, how can we prevent ourselves panicking If we can't affect change, the greed and power of the few will destroy us all and the whole world. I think that's quite a stark way of putting what a lot of us feel. Gareth, I think this is the next topic of your research as well. So I don't know if you have any response to that or any ideas that you've picked up.
So one thing I would say is, if you're interested in that, if it's a real live issue for you, I would like to talk to you, because I would like some volunteers to be in some discussion groups around this subject. I've just started another project, and it's really, how can we face the realities that we're facing at the moment? And it's exactly that question that you've just asked. What's our natural thing? It's fight or flight, isn't it? So we want to run away if there's a problem, but there's nowhere to run to anymore because this is a global problem. So what do we do in that case? Do we ignore it? Do we pretend it's not happening? Do we stick our heads in the sand? Or do we look through in our spiritual tradition, in our religious traditions, to find resources to help us to face what we're facing at the moment? So I suspect that the people who are on this call are engaged with the current situation, and that's why they're on the call today. Why are you engaged? Why are other people not engaged? What is it about your life, about your history, about your beliefs, about you as a person that makes you engaged? That's one of the things that we want to talk about. I don't really have answers at this stage because we're just starting the problem. I don't think, as I talked about dark night, I talked about impasse, because I don't really think that culturally we have many answers at the moment. We're feeling our way towards the answers. Pope Francis is really helpful. He's been described as an icon of the Anthropocene. He's a kind of icon of how we need to move forward into this new reality that we're facing at the moment. But he would be the first person to admit that he doesn't have all of the answers. He specifically said that in a document a few years ago. He said, "Don't be looking at this Pope for the answers." He's asking us to do our bit and to find the answers. So, Eileen, I don't know if you can put my email address in the chat, or if people should contact you or what. But if people are genuinely interested in this, I would like to talk to you further. And particularly if you're a CAFOD volunteer, if you're somebody who's engaged in some way.
I think maybe the easiest way everyone who's listening has had an email with the link to join tonight. If you just click reply to that and let us know that you're interested in joining Gareth's study, then we can make sure the names will get passed on to Gareth. Excellent. And Father George, Joanna, did you have anything you wanted to respond to that panic and dark night?
I've lost my window.
Oh, Joanna, I heard you for a second. You went, oh, there we are.
No, I mean, yeah, I think Gareth said it all. I think for me, I think we hold on to hope. I mean, hope is one of the supernatural virtues. And actually, it says to lose hope and despair is one of the biggest sins. So we hold on to our faith and we continue to hope. And alongside hope, we act. And when we're paralyzed by that fear, I think we connect. And it could be like, connecting with others, could be connecting with, your spiritual community, and maybe, some of the work that Gareth is doing, comes in there. I know there's like groups, Laudato Si movements and so on that you can, join and share your fears about some of these things. So, but most importantly, I think we cling to hope.
Mm. Father George, you're on mute.
Okay, hello?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I totally agree with Gary that because we have a greater responsibility for a discussion as well as to take this forward. I think each and every one of us got a greater responsibility to care for our Mother Earth and also to look after one another. It's look after one another is especially the most poor and the most marginalized. And when we really support one another in different ways, especially like when we join organizations like Caritas, CAFOD, and like church organizations, where they are very much interested to like take care of one another. I think we should like become as one family to like respond towards that. I think like it's never late than ever. So I think like we all should join hands together and work towards this.
Thank you. And if you're looking at the chat at home, there's lots of ideas coming up there as well to do with the Laudato Si action platform, showing the letter film in your parish or your community. Lots of resources as well on the CAFOD website for teachers and schools and parishes. And you can contact your local CAFOD office as well to book a speaker for your parish or your school. So please do have a look there. When we close down the webinar in a few minutes, you'll be redirected to the CAFOD website anyway with some more information. But hope brings me on to my last question and my favourite bit of Laudate Deum, which is a quote: "The world sings of an infinite love. How can we fail to care for it?" So to round us off, panel, I wonder if you could each tell me one place in the world or in your life where you see that infinite love. And Joanna, I can see you nodding. You're eager to answer. You can go first.
Well, I see love every day. You know, I work for CAFOD, and you know, everything that we do to reach out to the poorest and to the most vulnerable is made possible by a gift given by someone somewhere. A gift from the compassionate heart of a person somewhere to a sister or a brother somewhere else in the world, somebody they do not know, somebody they may never meet, but somebody they've connected to in the spirit of love. So that is where I see love. And that's one of the things that also keeps on giving me hope.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Gareth?
So I'm going to say I see love in the relationship between parents and their children. I was talking before the webinar started to the other presenters about how I've got a 4-year-old and he's just learned to ride his bike recently and kind of how much I got from that experience. But this, we're talking about a new world here, really. We're talking about a civilization of love. That's what we want to move towards. How do we move towards a civilization of love? Well, one of the ways we do that is by being selfless. And one of the places where I think you really, really see selflessness is parents spending time bringing up the children, devoting the time to the children that they could be devoting to other things, to their own pleasures and so on. So I think that very small scale families, people bringing up children, being selfless, devoting time to their children is where I see love.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And Father George?
Yeah, I just thought to say this Mother Teresa's words, like give until it hurts you, because she was able to give so much of love to the poor. And she said, like, I always saw the face of Jesus in the smile of the poor. And poor means like we all are poor, like in some way or the other way, because like still like we are longing for love. I think like when we started to give love, we also started to get back love from others. So I think let's try to love one another, and it will never hurt anyone.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, everyone at home, for your questions. Now, if you're anything like me, you'll have been watching and listening to the news of what's going on in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories with horror this week. So I would like us to end our session this evening on a prayer, which Father George will lead us in for peace in the region. Please join in at home and join us in prayer this evening.
Let us pray. God of peace, bearer of hope, we seek your help for the people of the Middle East. Quiet the glamour of war and guide us towards peace. Where there is hatred and division, sow seeds of calm and openness. Where there is destruction, help us to rebuild. Where our children are crying, Bring us end to tears. Shelter your peoples and protect them. Guide them in and keep them from harm. Show us how to break down the barriers of history and fear and breathe the whispers of hope. Amen.
Amen. So thank you again to everyone tonight for our wonderful panel and for our audience joining us at home. If you look on CAFOD's website, cafod.org.uk/online talks, you can sign up to all of our coming webinars, our online meetings, so you can hear more about our work and meet more of our partners and our colleagues from around the world. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.